Order. Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Energy Security Net Zero Select Committee, our second session on revisiting the nuclear roadmap, and today we'll be looking at the nuclear workforce and skills pipeline in our first panel, and in our second panel, balancing national interests and community voices. Welcome to our first panel. We're looking forward to your evidence. We'll start, if you can, by introducing yourselves, starting please with David.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name's David Cunningham, chartered nuclear engineer, 43 years in the industry, currently working in the Middle East on new build projects. I've been doing new build now since 2013 in the Middle East predominantly.
Thank you. I'm Sue Ferns. I'm the Senior Deputy General Secretary at Prospect Trade Union.
Afternoon, Mark Rouse. I'm the Director for the Nuclear Skills Plan and Co-Chair of the Nuclear Skills Delivery Board, also around 40 years in the nuclear sector, one way or another.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us this afternoon. Mark, I will start with you, and we have noted, I'm sure all of us have noted, the very much stop-start approach to nuclear industry in the United Kingdom. How has that approach affected the development and retention of skills within the nuclear workforce, and what is the future strategy that we need to prevent a repeat of this kind of pattern?
Okay, so I guess it's stopped us investing in the future. We've become quite short-term and quite inward-looking, and the industry is too full of people who are a bit like me, who've been around rather a long time and of a certain demographic. So we've run the task force, we've had a good look at the sector, we've looked at the ambitions that government have and have now followed through on. And the task force led to the group that I am leading. It led to a group where government have invested money, they've invested people, they've taken people like me. I was managing director of Dounreay before I got a tap on the shoulder and asked if I'd be part of a cross-sector team. And that's the other part of it, joining together the civil and the defence side. So we've got money, we've got focus that came from the task force, and we're busy turning this into a project of delivery, not of discussions about the future and about what might be, but delivering some things, and very much with the mantra of failing fast, learning quick. Let's do some things, let's try some things in a way we've never done before, and learn from them as we're doing them. And I'm pleased to say we are nearly 2 years into operation and doing just that.
Thank you very much. David, your experiences from a number of countries, are other countries doing better at maintaining their nuclear construction skills?
We could look at the countries that are leading the way in the nuclear industry, China, Republic, South Korea, where they've had a continuous build programme for 40 years. South Korea started building nuclear power plants in 1986. They've now got 24 in operation and 2 in build, 2 in planning. So they've got this continuation throughout, so their workforce sees a career that is stable, and they are mobilised around the country where they need to be to follow the build programme. And interestingly, they just started a decommissioning programme where the first 2 reactors shut down, so they're starting to develop those skills as well. Other countries tend to buy it, which is a difficult challenge. So if you look at the UAE, where I was for 5 years, they bought in the workforce, and at the same time as building, they upskilled the local population, such that now they've got 4 units on the grid, and they're starting to take over with Emiratis in leadership roles.
Well, thank you. We will come to questions of competition between countries for skilled workers shortly. Before we do that, Sue, I think, I don't know if it's directly from you, but Prospect in written evidence said, the industry is well positioned to deliver another generation of these nuclear jobs if the government makes strong commitments to the sector. What commitments would you advocate for?
So I think some good measures have already been taken with the final investment decision on Cycle C and the decision to invest in SMRs. But I think we are still lacking certainty. So we have got a nuclear roadmap that tells us why we need a nuclear roadmap, but doesn't tell us exactly what we need, how it's going to be built, and who might build it. And I think it's that lack of certainty. The mood music is positive, but what we need is greater certainty about what the delivery programme is. Because we see, for example, around Hinkley Point C, that where there's greater certainty, you get the skills development, you get the commitment from younger people to the industry, they know they can get good local jobs. But that's not evident everywhere, and there's still a lot of pieces to be put into the jigsaw as far as we're concerned.
Thanks very much. We recommended the government commit to a fleet approach in our report last year on the national policy statements, as you'll know, and you gave evidence to us on that occasion. Is that the kind of difference that you're looking for?
Yes, absolutely. We need the long-term certainty that allows investors to be confident to invest not only in the kit but also in the skills. And we all know that investment in nuclear skills is not a short-term fix. It needs some certainty, some long-term planning, collaboration between government and industry. And for the people who are thinking about their futures, look, there is competition for skills. The members that we have, the younger members that we have, can choose to go into nuclear, but their skills are also in demand in other parts of the sector. And so they need to know that if they commit to nuclear, there's going to be a good long-term future for them.
Do you have any particular recommendations on sites for either large scale or further SMR?
So we advocate for a mixed economy of large scale and SMR sites. We would have liked to have seen a large scale reactor at Wilfer. It's good that there's commitment to investment there. We feel it's a bit of a wasted opportunity. But one of the other things we'd like to see is a better joined up approach between the decommissioning sector and the new build sector. Because we know there are sites that are due for decommissioning that with timely decisions could also be new build sites, whether that's gigawatt or SMR. I'm thinking, for example, about Hartlepool, Heysham and so on.
Okay, so using existing sites for new sites by having a more strategic approach.
A more strategic approach and a timely approach that allows skills transition that's already there to be retained within the industry and repurposed for a new build.
Is that what's happening in other countries? You mentioned decommissioning briefly in your comments.
It's early. The two main countries that are doing most of the building are China and South Korea. There are others that are building ones and twos, and they're in the same position as the United Kingdom is, where they're trying to figure out how do you get that certainty in long-term career prospects to maintain a workforce.
Yeah, and Mark, before I hand over to Lizzie, what are the specialist skills in nuclear that we lack compared to the wider construction sector? How long will it take us to develop those skills?
So we're focused on your health physics monitors, your specialist scientists, people who need PhDs or specific training. We estimate that's about 20% of the population though, so most of the population is skills for nuclear that can come from many places and be used in that environment. And we're running programs to try and accelerate these things. You know, does it take 7 to 10 years to get somebody into a productive place, or can we get their brain power engaged more readily by using other experts who'll bring them in and bring them up to speed in the sites a lot quicker? So there are scarce skills in nuclear, and we're very focused on recruiting those.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. Lizzie, yeah.
As it came up, Chair, and as we've got some expertise here, I wanted to ask briefly around the semi-urban population density criteria, and as it applies to Heysham currently. We have 2 operating nuclear power stations, but we can't build SMRs there because of that. Now, that's been recommended for review in Fingleton, but you know, because I'm trying to join all the dots here between making sure the workforce in Heysham and elsewhere around the country has that pipeline through and those skills. So I'm wondering if the panel have any comments on how important that regulatory review is to building that skills pipeline, and if there's any comments in particular around the semi-urban population density criteria and your thoughts. I'm thinking particularly of you, David, given your professional background, and what we should be doing with that instead.
To look at is that our ability and our skills in developing safety cases has advanced significantly since the population density criteria were set.
Yeah.
So we now do much more advanced safety case analysis around probabilistic and deterministic failures. So it would be, with the Generation 3 plants, the giga plants, that would be much, be careful how I say this, it's more possible to demonstrate safe operations within urban populations. I have to qualify that the 2 new builds that I've done in the 2 countries that I've worked in are very remote.
Yeah.
So
I'm just thinking of, you know, we have our 2 operating nuclear power stations already there, safely operating for decades. We have nuclear submarines that I presume come quite close to large population centres. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Chair. Just wanted to...
Mel, you, I think you've got some questions on national and international competition for skilled workers.
Yes, thank you. To start with Sue, and just ask about how significant the competition for skilled workers is, mainly across different sectors really, whether it's energy, defence, transport, other major infrastructure projects, and do you think that there's a risk to the timeline and time frame for delivery of the nuclear programme, given that we've already seen quite extensive delays in the nuclear programme, haven't we?
Yes, I do. Look, in Prospect we represent people working across energy, defence, transport and other major infrastructure, and at the moment they can absolutely choose where they take their skills. A whole range of skills, some specialist skills, but project managers. I think we also need to be clear that these are not all high-level skills. Competition for construction and craft skills is very high as well. And we have seen, for example, people transitioning out of oil and gas who've chosen to take their skills overseas because it's more beneficial for them to do that. So I think we have to be very careful about competition for skills, but I do think if we can be clear about the long-term certainty, because these are, nuclear creates good jobs, it creates good local jobs for communities, skilled jobs, jobs with an opportunity for a career. So there will always be, if you like, market competition in terms of salary, but I think we need to look more holistically about what nuclear is offering to people, and primarily it has to be about the certainty of the career and the ability to get on in the sector. I think there's a lot of commitment to it. I think it's really important for communities, but I think we have to be very clear not to be complacent that people will just come into nuclear because they do have other choices. And particularly in the private sector, you know, there's some very competitive packages being offered. So partly as well, I think there's an issue about where people are in their career cycle. It may be younger people without other commitments who are more attracted to go and work.
I'll do it to close now, Sue, if that's all right, just because I've got a couple of other questions for the other panellists. Thank you so much for that. I wonder, Mark, we've had some evidence from other witnesses to this inquiry talking about the UK's kind of siloed approach to skills development and the different projects and different areas of delivery of big projects. Do you think that there is any hope of any kind of integrated skills model that would actually help?
There's a lot of hope for integrating the skills model to create a thing that is a sophisticated integrated skills model that covers all the various projects. I don't think will ever happen, but we're putting a lot of effort into...
Not an achievable outcome?
Not in its fine detail, but joining things together within the nuclear sector, so starting with civil and defence, joining them together, then going into clean energy and working with the Office for Clean Energy Jobs, then working with Skills England and other devolved skills.
Too many bodies? There's too many groups?
There are a lot of groups. This thing's evolved like mad for a lot of years, but we're sitting in the middle of this and starting to glue things together. Because they're all doing great things, but they're not as connected as we'd like, and we're certainly bringing that to it.
And David, Sue just sort of touched on, it's not all about salaries, but do you think that UK salaries, career pathways, perhaps even entry pathways into work, different working conditions, patterns, do you think that compared to the international nuclear markets are suitably attractive, suitably visible? Do you think that there is more that could be done?
But at the entry level, I think we're starting to attract the right people. We're setting up apprenticeships. We're putting graduate programs in place. I spoke to Mark a couple of weeks ago, and universities are starting to get engaged. And
does it all have to be about apprenticeships and graduate programs? Are there other kind of base level training and entry routes that could be open?
Personally think you can enter at any level, but if there's a career path and you've got the right skills and aptitude, you'll grow through that. I started life as an apprentice, and now I'm a very senior.
I think I just take a bit of a view on apprenticeships that they are harder to get, that the expectations of levels of qualifications are that those levels are even higher. So, if you're not meeting those requirements, then you can't even get a look in.
In our industry, there's a requirement to demonstrate that you're suitably qualified and experienced. So you have to have the base competency that's demonstrable. Then you have to build on top of that the experience. One of the challenges, you do apprenticeships and they get a certificate, that's not the end of the road. They then have to go in what I term journeyman's time, the old-fashioned apprentices that did indentured apprenticeships, then did journeyman's time, became masters in their craft, and then can't continue to grow. But there's no reason why you shouldn't start as a mechanic, get a mid-career apprenticeship and move through that way. There's lots of different ways to do it.
Okay, thank you. So next one, me as well. Yeah. Okay, thank you. This is to Mark, the National Nuclear Strategic Plan for Skills, catchy title. Is it on track to deliver the supposed 40,000 additional workers that are required by 2030? And if it is it, who is responsible for making sure that target is met? Who is accountable for that?
Okay, so simple answer, yes, from the early evidence. We've moved from needing 40,000 extra jobs by 2030 to now 24,000. So the dial is moving significantly, but it doesn't get easier. So we've got a lot of tests to...
recruited 16,000 people?
Yep, that's from last year's nuclear... Yep, that's from last year's nuclear workforce assessment carried out by Cogent Skills. So independently, they've gone to all the companies and said, what are the numbers? What has moved? I'm not kidding myself that that's the end of the equation and that we just keep ploughing onto that. But we're governed by a group called the Nuclear Skills Executive Council. Oh, and I should say, we've dropped the long title. It's the Nuclear Skills Plan. It is too big a mouthful. But the Executive Council is chaired by DG level in MOD and DESNES. And is made up of the chief executives of the prime nuclear companies. And that, for me, is the real game changer. Suddenly you've got the leaders of these businesses doing what's needed and supporting a funded team to go on and drive all the initiatives to try and get the skills in. So they are ultimately accountable, the people who pay the money into the system and the people who run these businesses. And we're not forgetting the supply chain, but we're bringing them in now that we've got this council established and leading the way.
And how are they accountable?
They are accountable into government. So as I say, government chair those committees. We have turned this into a project of targets and metrics and numbers, not just aspirations and wish lists. And they monitor against that. And we look at who is leading, who is following, who is achieving what.
Removed if they're not achieving?
I guess the chairs could choose to do that, but we want all of those companies involved. This is not about, this is about proving that collective effort. This is about proving that a collective can do more than the individuals, and that's what the numbers are suggesting so far.
Just wondering how people are accountable if nobody's going to be removed if this 16,000 does not materialise up to 40,000.
there will be pressure applied to the system as there is now. We don't hit every target every time in the moment, so there is pressure applied.
Sue, what more should government and industry do to strengthen the nuclear skills pipeline at every level, including apprenticeships, undergraduate programmes and PhD training?
So I think the nuclear skills plan is a welcome contribution. It obviously is making a contribution. Look, I think if we're going to meet those targets, we've got to be looking at people who aren't currently in the nuclear workforce. And I think that means diversifying the workforce. It means, as you just touched on, attracting people in who can't meet the academic requirements for apprenticeships. And it means thinking about the transition, the energy transition, and have we got a proper strategy to ensure that people moving from other sectors can move into nuclear. I think there may be initiatives in each of those areas. I don't think there's a joined up programme, and I don't think it's necessarily visible to everybody. And I think there's a lot that the private sector can do, but given the level of government investment in this sector, I think there's probably more leverage that government could apply in terms of training requirements when it is providing funding for new projects.
And Mark, the nuclear skills plan is meant to be increasing academic places, but they seem to be decreasing those, as well as the centres for doctoral training. Why is that?
So I can't announce it in this committee, but there's some things coming along where government have invested significant money in the centres for doctoral training. So our target is to quadruple the number, and we are on target, and we'll announce that at the end of the month.
And why has it fallen over the last 3 years? Just a funding issue?
Lack of investment, the cycle that the CDTs have gone through themselves. Some were on the up and some were coming to a natural conclusion.
And industry hasn't felt the need to keep that steady for its own sake?
The whole process is based on match funding, and again, going forward, we have got significant match funding from industry, so we're pretty pleased with the way things are going to develop, but I do accept there was a bit of a lull whilst we got ourselves into action and leveraged a significant amount of money.
What does a bit of a lull mean? What was
the industry was getting the funding in place, getting the spending reviews in place.
Yeah, what does it mean in terms of the impact of that lull, though? What does the
we stayed flat. We
look like?
We didn't reduce the CDTs. We found money when we thought one of the CDTs might slow down, so we maintained the numbers, and we're now quadrupling going forward from next year.
Well, you didn't maintain the numbers because they went down. They fell over a 3-year period. So I was just asking, what did they look like 3 years ago, and what do they look like now?
The numbers I've got said that we stayed steady, that we were worried about one of the CDTs closing. We found the money to
Well, the Nuclear
fund
Futures
them.
Institute at Bangor University says that undergraduate students' number of Centre for Doctoral Trainers in fission-related subjects has fallen over the last 3 years. That's not the same as your information. Why isn't it the same?
I'm not sure. I'd have to go and check those numbers.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Torkel.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for coming in and for your evidence. Can I just, before I move on to my own questions, can I just pick up a little bit on what Mel was saying about skills, and particularly in relation to Scotland, where we've got Thurso and Hunterston running down, and presumably perhaps you're best placed to give us a picture of what happens to that workforce and what happens to regenerating that workforce should Scotland have another nuclear right.
There's a great deal of concern amongst the workforce and amongst their communities, because these are good jobs. They're worried about what will happen to those in the future and the impact on their own careers and also on their communities as well. There is a joint trade union campaign which is designed to influence the Scottish Government, whatever the Scottish Government is, after the election, to keep the nuclear option open. We think it's a really important contributor to the Scottish economy, but we're very, very concerned about it at the moment.
Okay, thanks for that. And David, you mentioned earlier that there were two kinds of country that do nuclear, those that build and those that buy. And we're going to be like with SMRs and advanced modular reactors, some of that be bought off the shelf, I'm guessing.
Sorry, buy in terms of buy the people.
Yeah.
And the technology.
Will the jobs be here in the UK, or will they be international jobs?
Both. So if, for example, we were to choose to build, the best example is the AP1000 from Westinghouse. It's American technology. A lot of the supply chain is already in existence. I think there's 16 of those plants in construction around the world. So you would be buying a lot of it from outside. The technology, the operating of the technology and the construction can be largely done in the UK, but it will require significant uplift in skills. And I think the way to do that, my experience shows me that you have a broad approach where you upskill your local communities and you bring in some external support.
And so these nuke reactors will involve fewer people, won't they? In construction and in running. So
yes.
We'll have fewer nuclear jobs at these sites.
Yeah, well,
No?
it's, until we get these new reactors built, it's difficult to be precise exactly about how many jobs there'll be, and it also depends how they're done as well. But for example, if you look at Sizewell C, you've got 3,000 jobs there for you've got 10,000 jobs there for 3 gigawatt of generation. And the projections for Wilver are 3,000 jobs for 1.4 gigawatts, which tends to suggest that SMRs are around 30% less jobs rich than large-scale reactors. That's not to say that those jobs aren't important, but they do appear to be less jobs rich. Of course, it does also depend on what commitments are given in terms of supply chain, for example, in relation to steel, pressure vessels or nuclear fuel. All of that has the opportunity to increase jobs, UK jobs, but we don't know that that's going to happen yet. As I understand it, those commitments haven't been made as yet in relation to Wilver. So welcome jobs, but less jobs rich than large-scale reactors.
Good. And Mark, when you were responding to Mel there, you talked about a lull, financial lull really in the sector. And I just wondered what can be done to kind of incentivise private money to come in, so you got a consistent flow all the way through?
It's been mentioned already that they need that certainty and certainty to a certain level that will allow people to invest and seeing it as something that is not just locked into the nuclear sector. As I said earlier, we're trying to work with other sectors, other parts of our sector, so that we create a pool of people that the country can move around. What I would hate to do is create this huge nuclear workforce and then just wrap our arms around them and trap them, especially as projects and programs move around. There is skill base to be used, and because they are 80% skills for nuclear, they can be moved around. They can do rail infrastructure, they can do civil infrastructure.
That's one of the biggest resentments of host communities, though, isn't it? That like the money flies in on Monday and flies out on a Thursday to go and live either internationally or in London or far away from the host community. What can we do to stop that?
I mean, a lot of our work is through our regional skills hubs. We recognise we're running a national programme with national imperatives, but that it happens in the various regions and devolved nations. So we're trying to understand what is the pattern of work there. Not everybody's on the same life cycle. Not all the same things happen. It's never as convenient as you'd like that just when you want everybody to finish at Hinkley C and move to Sizewell. That won't happen like that, but mapping those individual areas, understanding what else is competing, so that you've got that community of people who can do a range of tasks.
And Sue, you must see that pattern as well amongst your members of work in one place but live in another place. And certainly we know with Scottish workers going south every week and coming back.
Yeah, absolutely.
What kind of effect does that have on A, on the workforce, and B, on host workers and their families, I guess, and B, on host communities? And what can be done about it?
Well, some people are obviously willing to do that, but it does have stress on individuals and on their families. Obviously, a large degree of separation. We have had incidences of younger workers as well with extreme mental health issues and actually 1 or 2 suicides from prolonged absence away from home. So it is the way it is because those are the skilled workers that we've got at the moment, but it's not ideal. And actually, I think what a lot of people would like to see is a nuclear roadmap that allows their skills to be used within range of their own home communities.
Are there any international lessons or comparators, or does this industry work the same way globally? Is there anything we can learn from the existing sites in the UK or abroad?
Observation that the nuclear industry is moving into, it's a global industry now, and the skills will move. And it's not just professional engineers, it's welders, it's health physicists. They go where they're attracted. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the I mean, I grew up on the west coast of Scotland, and I'm worried myself about what happens when the skills move away from Hunterston. Because how do you keep them, how do you get them back? And once they've moved, they settle, and their children settle, and they on effect. Looking at the United Arab Emirates, where I've spent 5 years, much smaller country, but physically the size of Wales. So if you imagine that the power plant was equivalent of where Cardiff is, and a lot of the people lived in the north of the country, in the Northern Emirates, which probably about the same distance as Wilfer, they're showing now that difficulty in retaining people because they just want to go home. So they've attracted them during the build phase. They're now struggling to maintain those operators because they get fed up travelling, and that's just human nature. They want to be with their families.
Is that something we should look out for here?
Yes, and I think the opportunity, and you mentioned about the Scottish Government's current policy, if with Hunterston running down, that's an ideal site in my mind for an SMR project, because or Haitian as well, because it retains the skills and it gives long-term certainty that Mark was talking to, which allows people to plan their career and say there's a future in this for me, so I'll stick with it.
Okay. Mark, you want to come in here?
I think it's a reminder to us all that we bandy around some great big numbers, be they people, regions or money. There's real people behind these, and we have to take that into account when we're just moving the numbers around, that those real people, the experience they have, and we try to factor that into the grand strategies.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Thanks,
Thanks. David, I just want to come back because I missed it earlier when you answered to Torkel. The potential for job losses in the UK through factory construction, and we heard in our last session, likely in career. So to what extent should we be concerned about that for SMRs and AMRs?
So I was talking to a former colleague at the weekend who, him and his wife are both experienced nuclear professionals, currently working in Vienna on IEA work, and they're looking to where to go next. 10 years ago in new build they had one choice, and it was in Abu Dhabi. Now there are 64 power stations in construction, 67 from the IEA figures this morning. So people that are willing to move have got tremendous opportunity to do that. So that's the factory construction element of the supply chain. Yeah. If you look at Westinghouse, they're building in multiple countries. They'll build their supply chain in one place and farm it out. So Korea did the same. So Korea's supply chain came from Korea to the Emirates, and that has now been lined up to supply Czech Republic because the Czechs are building a modified version of the Korean plant.
And those are jobs that are likely to stay in other countries rather than coming in. Yeah, thank you. Claire.
Thank you. So I want to ask a few questions around how the government can stimulate lasting private investment in nuclear skills. And Sue, you've already talked about the need for that long-term plan, for the certainty, but are there any other things that the government can do to incentivise private sector investment in nuclear skills and workforce development beyond 2030?
I think, as I said, there's a lot of government money here. I think, look, we've got Great British Energy Nuclear, we've got the National Wealth Fund, and I think we need to also to think about what an active industrial strategy actually means in terms of government incentivisation and directive. The government is spending a lot of public money. I think it's perfectly reasonable for it to have expectations in terms of investment, not just only in the plan but in the skills as well. Who gives something for nothing? Nobody does. It's in our national interest for government to set expectations. For example, percentage of workforces that are on apprenticeships, the quality of jobs being created, the contribution to social value, for example. I don't think there are perfect instruments to do that at the moment, but as I said, I think we have the foundation. I know the government is looking separately at public procurement and what the strategy might be for public procurement. So I think there are various opportunities there to make sure that if we have a roadmap which provides the long-term certainty, that the private companies who are going to invest in it but also benefit from it give back their fair share to the workforce, to the skills and to the community.
And how do you think you secure that commitment? Is there a particular formal mechanism?
Well, there are contracts to be signed, aren't there? For example, there's a contract to be signed for the Rolls-Royce development at Wilver. In a different sector, in offshore wind, we have, as trade unions, just been involved in discussions with the employers in that sector and government about a fair work charter, whereby the employers give commitment to certain standards of employment, creation of good opportunities for people. So I think there's an opportunity for initiatives like that to be rolled out more widely as well. I think there's a number of opportunities, but I think we need to turn our minds and really focus on those. And now's the time to do it before those investments are being made.
In terms of Mark, we talked about sort of Monday to Thursday jobs, and that has historically been the situation for many of the sort of elite jobs. So should all major projects be obligated to secure lasting community benefits so that the local community is securing some of these jobs? And if so, how?
Well, yes, I think everybody in the nuclear sector and the industry is committed to that sort of local footprint. We know we get a huge permission from our local communities to do what we do in the industry. But it's a balance that's been talked about. You want to feed the local community, you want to have that hotbed of skills that really respect nuclear. They don't fear it. I've never seen fear in local communities, but a lot of respect, a lot of understanding. But then you've got people who want to move around, and they can't always further their careers in the local area. So it's getting that balance and seeing what's possible. And we mentioned pathways and curriculums. Being able to explain in a sector that is probably one of the least understood and kind of closed shops, what is possible? Nuclear, in my experience, is it's a normal community of people. There are some very, very clever people. There are a whole community of people who work on a nuclear site or on nuclear projects. And being able to paint to people there are ways in of that, there are ways out of it, there are ways back in it again. You're not sort of stuck and following one path.
Is there a danger sometimes that the focus on local jobs focuses on the lower paid ones requiring fewer qualifications?
Not in my experience, and a lot of my experience comes from running the facility in Dounreay. Thurso had the highest IQ in the UK for a lot of time. They called them the atomics. It attracted people there. I'm sure if we look at other communities, it drives high IQ. I guess as Dave said, some of those people are very in demand. People will wave monies in front of them, opportunities to broaden themselves, that they will like to move. So that might create a certain difference. But I don't think it creates that difference in itself.
Okay. And turning to David, do you think there are any lessons that can be learnt about developing a workforce pipeline for future sites, either from the current UK nuclear sites or international projects?
I spoke to the talent acquisition manager for Baraka, who lifted from nothing to 4 operating power plants, and that's effectively like taking one of our UK sites, say Wilfer, and how do you get people? And he talked about high impact teams, streamlined recruitment, moving quickly, getting the salary base real so that it was attractive, promoting the project globally so you're attracting people all over the time, making it attractive for people to come, and use innovative strategies in how to recruit and how to attract and then retain. It's the retention that's the problem, and we shouldn't be scared about the fact that people move, because people moving for their careers allows that growth. You're always going to get it, and I've found that when people move, the person that comes in might bring new ideas that help promote a better way of doing things. The Koreans, they're much more stable because they started in '86 and they've had a continuous build programme throughout, so that's great. If you look at what's happening in Turkey and in Egypt, where they've bought VVR plants from Russia, they're sending all their, they're bringing people into colleges, if you will, technical colleges, and then they're sending them to Russia for 2 or 3 years to get the skills on plant, and then bringing them back again. I think the Poles are looking at buying people in. The Czechs, for example, are looking at, because they've got an established nuclear program, they're looking at doing it themselves in-house without using the global market. Is that?
This long gap, we're sort of stuck in the middle, aren't we? In that we do have a history of nuclear, but we've had a long break.
There's a black hole behind me, because I came into the industry in the 80s, and then we stopped building, and the recruitment opportunities, the career opportunities fell off after we built Sizewell B.
So are there other examples internationally
where it's dropped and picked
where
up
it's
again?
dropped and picked up, and how have
I
they done the
think
picking
you'll
up?
see similar in America. That's starting to happen because they're starting to reopen plants, and they've just opened Palo Verde, recently commissioned Palo Verde. Canadians as well, where they've had a dip. So there's similarities. I don't think there's anybody further ahead than we are. We're all in the same challenge, if you will.
Okay, thank you. And this is also me as well, isn't it? So, and so just thinking now, I mean, I represent an area which has got a decommissioning power station. So, Sue, often the sort of political focus is on the new reactors. We all like new and shiny in politics, don't we? But nuclear obviously requires skills across that entire life cycle. And do you think that focus has overshadowed the needs of decommissioning, waste management, and regulation?
Yeah, I do. I think if you look at the focus on new build, where it's a largely very positive story, and then you look at decommissioning, then you will know in your own constituency and across the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, they're in the process of downsizing jobs by, 1,200 or so. And I have asked, and I don't think there's any monitoring or check about what skills are being lost as a result of that. There should be clearly a much better joined up approach there. Look, completing the decommissioning mission is essential for a vibrant new build sector. I don't think we say that enough. I don't think we value the decommissioning mission sufficiently. And on current experience, neither do we value the decommissioning workforce sufficiently. They're getting one story, the new build workforce is getting a completely different story, but actually it's all part of the same cycle. So when we're thinking about how we use skills, how we value people, then we need to be much clearer and joined up in the way that we do that, and there's a huge gap there at the moment.
The same dip, but shifted decades on, in that there's going to be a period where we weren't building, and given we're extending lives of power stations, there's going to be a period where you're not going to be adding to the number being decommissioned as much. There'll be a period where we are, which is now, but then there'll be that same dip, won't there? So can people sort of freely move back and forth between the two, or are they seen as distinct workforces?
At the moment, they're seen as distinct workforces, and obviously the decommissioning workforce is ostensibly it's a public sector workforce. I mean, it's easy to talk about people moving from one area to another, but in practical terms, you've got to think about their contracts of employment, what barriers exist to movement. And the industry is not very good at thinking around ways of reducing or removing those barriers. There are lots of practical things to think about there, and we need to be better at that.
Okay. Mark, so would you say the UK is preparing enough skilled personnel for the long-term decommissioning waste programmes, or are we going to have a shortage in this?
A challenge ahead. We've recognised that we've got a hell of a challenge ahead, and we're starting to act on it, but it's a big ask to create those kind of numbers given the gaps that we've had given the different phasing of the different projects. So that's why the approach is to act as that collaborative sector, to start saying, you've got this wonderfully skilled workforce who do really difficult and challenging things in decommissioning. They can be used in other areas. We've got people with ex-military backgrounds who've led really dynamic and interesting lives. How do you find them roles in these projects? We're only 18 months, nearly 2 years in. You know, destination nuclear is the first visible sign of it, but they're the first time we've ever operated as a sector where we've ever sat down, and I've got a strong background in safety from the nuclear sector, where I saw no barriers. Everybody shares, everybody opens up and says, I've got a problem here, can you help me? I'm just beginning to see the beginnings of that in our group. So as you said, downturns in some areas, where are those skills going? Where could they be used? They've already gone up a learning curve. How could they find somebody else who's in a trough? But then you take into the different wages, different locations. So we are trying to sit in the middle, have our databases, understand the people and who will fit where, which is where certainty comes back again. It's very hard to do that if everything is a variable. If you've got some fixed bits, you can start making some big decisions.
I would just say, I agree with that. Let's just be clear, we've talked about it, it's a competitive market. So industry will talk about collaboration, and I would love to see more collaboration. But what I'm seeing just now is a competitive market, i.e. companies acting. I'm not saying they do it all the time, but you know, the imperative, if you're accountable to shareholders, is to act in the interests of the organisation that you're running. So collaboration, absolutely a great objective. Reality can be shareholder returns. We need these people now. We will compete and we will get those people.
So you should be getting that decommissioning capability in place before committing to further new builds?
I think what we need to do is commit to new builds so that the workforce that are currently in the decommissioning sector can see a pathway to their future employment. That's absolutely what we should be doing. That's why we need the roadmap, the clear roadmap and certainty now. That way we will keep the skills in the workforce, and those people on decommissioning sites won't have to move halfway across the country. They should be able to move on to a new project on the site where they're already working.
David, you look like you wanted to say something.
I just think, if we take this as a long-term programme, so the roadmap takes us out to 2050, if you take that view, you're going to get a cycle. You're going to have new builds, they're going to go into operation, and then they're going to go to decommissioning. Eventually you'll get a stability and a sort of stable throughput, which, as Sue said, you can then take the workforce and use the decommissioning skills, put them back into new build, because decommissioning and commissioning are very similar in terms of the skills that are needed, so they can be repurposed, reprogrammed.
You mentioned this division between effectively public sector for the decommissioning versus the competing private sector companies building the new power stations. Do you see that distinction as being a problem, and do you have any suggestions for?
Decommissioning is not attractive because it's seen as the end of life, whereas if you're an enthusiastic engineer, you want to be doing new stuff, you want to be building stuff, not making sure it's safe as you take it apart. But I think it's part of a career because, as Mark said, the whole focus of the nuclear industry around safety and understanding safety, and everything you do is safe. You can learn a lot about safety working in decommissioning that it can be brought back into new build, and equally working in new builder operations. You've got that safety culture embedded. So there is, if you use it as part of a career path, if you're managing careers, and so you go off into a little bit here, a little bit there. Like, I was in the Navy for 30 years. My career was managed. I was sent to do the jobs I needed to do as I moved up the ladder. So there's no reason why in a nuclear industry you can't say, right, you need these skill sets to move up in seniority. So you do a little bit of decommissioning, a little bit of new build, a little bit of operations, a little bit of research, so the professional careers. The technical careers, the technicians and the workforce equally can bring skills across all sectors.
So is there some formal mentoring role or something that the industry needs to be managing its workforce?
I think there's an opportunity. Where if you look, I was reading about this in Japan. What happens? People that get to my age, I'm 60, you're about to come out the top. they get not repurposed, that's very unfair word. But you become mentoring, you go into coaching so that you're not losing the skills as they retire into sunset. France has got problems at the moment because a lot of the people that built their fleet are now in the 70s and have long since retired. So the opportunity for us, as we see the people of my generation come to the end, is bring them back in to help mentor the bit in the middle. And it's the hollow middle that's the problem at the moment. We've talked about bringing people in at the bottom, and I think that's great. More apprentices, more graduates, more different ways of getting people in. If you're not academically clever enough to get an apprenticeship, well, go and demonstrate skills through experience. That's how I got my master's degree, through skills through prior knowledge. And then use the experienced people to help mentor and grow them. So you've got this obvious cycle almost with nuclear skills. And that works in all industry, by the way. That's not just particular to nuclear. That can work in any industry.
Nuclear is the way it's had the dip and then...
Yes.
Yeah. And did you want to add anything more on that?
We call it sector experts into training as one of our programmes to try and do that. And it has two benefits. Firstly, it gets those sector experts to go and train people, and it creates a gap to pull people through. You know, I used a phrase, I needed to get out of my own way at Dounreay, because I'm sat there at the head of the organisation stopping people coming through. And often there's quite a big age gap, so you look at it and you go, well, they can't possibly. Of course they can. You know, people had faith in us. We were good enough when we were younger. They're good enough now. But if we're all sat there just running the organisations, rather than stepping aside, giving our guidance and our support, then the whole thing deadheads. But it is a challenge, isn't it? It is a dip. There is a big gap in there that we just have to acknowledge and work with.
Thank you. Melanie, you would come back to one of your earlier questions.
I did, yeah. Mark, I wanted to just check on some numbers, because you were saying that over the last year 16,000 people have been recruited towards this additional 40,000 target, but the NIA says 11,000. I just wondered why there would be a 5,000 person discrepancy.
Yeah, we work with NIA. They are looking at different things through a different lens. Our data comes from talking direct to the companies themselves and asking them, how many people have you got in your company at this moment? How do we judge it against the demand figure that they create? That's where the 40,000 originally came from. So it's measuring that difference.
So you do a survey of the companies. Do you get 100% return on the survey, or do you have to extrapolate some of the numbers?
We get 100% from our primes. We are having to extrapolate a little bit on the supply chain, and we are currently working with the NIA to improve that.
And you include supply chain in this 40,000 figure?
The way we describe it is we model it, based on some discussions.
How far down the tail of the supply chain do you go?
The modelling makes assumptions about the very big companies and the very small companies. As I say, we've just initiated some work, working with NIA and ADS on the defence side to refine that data.
Okay. And do you know what the model is that the NIA uses compared to your...
I don't personally. I know the team have talked to the NIA.
So when you're doing on the basis that I also used to do these surveys of companies and businesses, and it was never that easy to get the data and get it in a timely fashion and necessarily get it accurately, and given that some jobs were on a part-time basis or a contracted basis or whatever it might be, I mean, how confident are you in that 16,000 figure compared to the NIA that presumably would be very confident in their 11,000 figure?
I'm confident in where it comes from. I'm confident it isn't perfect to decimal places. It's why we see the data as one of our big areas of investment, that we need to understand the nuances of our sector. You know, if I get this right to decimal places, I'm probably missing the point of there are some big numbers here. There's some big shifts in the number of people we need to attract.
But given that one of the questions was who's accountable for getting these additional 40,000 jobs, and we've lost 5,000 in half an hour, which isn't really very good. So
different basis of counting. We're confident for the questions we've asked.
So it's a spreadsheet rounding error between different methodologies. I mean, 5,000 is not a decimal point, actually, is it? It's quite a lot.
Different measures for different reasons.
Well, Sue, would you feel confident in saying that this 40,000 potential new members of Prospect?
That would be fantastic. Look, I'm not confident in the number. I don't know exactly what it is that each organisation is measuring. I don't know whether they're measuring what's going out at the other end as well.
It'd be helpful to have a single stat that everybody can kind of come together and say, this is definitely the number, and this is, we are actually making progress. We're not extrapolating down, you know, even the percentage between what is your primary employers versus what is your supply chain. Because if your supply chain is 80% of your numbers versus 20% of the primary, then potentially your extrapolation is on 80% of the figures, which is just, you know, wouldn't be accurate.
Agree, absolutely.
That brings us to the end of the first panel. Can I thank you very much for your evidence this afternoon. We will take a short break while we convene the second panel. Order. Order, order. Welcome back to this afternoon's session of the Energy Security Net Zero Select Committee, revisiting the nuclear roadmap. Welcome to panel 2 on balancing national interests and community voices. And if you can introduce yourselves, please, starting on this side.
My name is Jan Lights. I'm a science communicator and I've been involved in nuclear communications for quite a long time, but I'm not part of the industry officially.
Good afternoon, my name is Councillor Struan Mackie. I represent the Thurso and North West Caithness ward on the Highland Council, and I'm also the chair of the Dounreay Stakeholder Group, which is the statutory site stakeholder group for the Dounreay civil nuclear site as well as the defence site at Vulcan.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Richard Rout. I'm Suffolk County Council's Cabinet Member for Devolution, Local Government Reform and Nationally Significant Infrastructure Projects, and I'm also the Chair of the New Nuclear Local Authorities Group, or NLAG.
Well, thank you, and you are all welcome. We look forward to your evidence. I will start. So, nuclear development can be highly disruptive. From the experience of Hinckley and Sizewell, what are the most significant impacts on local communities as far as you're concerned?
So I have actually been down to visit those communities several times and other communities like Wilfer, and I actually find there's quite a lot of support and not concern about impact. Obviously you can talk about noise and more vehicles on the road, small things, but most people tend to be quite supportive and not concerned. I find the loudest voices tend to be people who either don't live in the area or in some cases have like a second home there, and so they want it to be a nice quiet place, and then obviously that's disrupted. But in terms of local support, it's usually quite high. People are very supportive, particularly because of the jobs aspect.
Well, thank you. And the committee heard some very similar comments when we visited the Sizewell C site. I'm sure we will come on to some of that. Struan, are these impacts inherent to the development process, would you say, where we get some opposition, at least, or can they be better mitigated through planning and early engagement?
I think early engagement is really important. I think in many respects there's an awful lot of consultation with the community at the tail end of the planning process. I think when we're talking about siting, when we're talking about what the vision is for these installations and also how nationally important they are, that's when we need to be having as much dialogue with communities as possible. But I would absolutely agree with the point that I think particularly within nuclear communities that have already got sites, we kind of understand what disruption looks like. We've seen it over decades, we've seen different degrees of development. But in addition to that, I think that we're certainly in a position where the type of development going forward, I would say, is maybe slightly different to some of the legacy stuff. So that's where we do need to kind of look at what the fleet approach looks like and also the SMR.
Yeah, and Richard, just to pick up on that point, do you think that with the development of different types of technology, that brings additional challenges for communities who are perhaps less familiar or have a different set of concerns to what's been there before?
Thank you, Chair. I was first, if I might pick up on one of Zion's points, because I think it was interesting, her reflection on Sizewell, and I think it depends on how you look at the geography. So if you look at Leiston, a community that's used to hosting a nuclear power station, yes, within that town, welcoming. But then if you get a little further away, then that's where the opposition is. In terms of new technologies, I think it really depends on the communities which will be hosting it. I think if you look at sort of formerly industrial areas that are used to or have lost industrial sectors, then I think, yes, they would be quite welcoming. But I think nuclear does bring with it fears, many of which are unsubstantiated, but that's where the early engagement is key, and perhaps we might come to engagement and consultation later.
Yes, we will do. Thank you. Torkel.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for coming in. See, I'm really interested in what you said there about the loudest voices aren't often from the host community, they're from people who've come in, you seem to say, and from holiday homeowners. And in fact, you might have been one of these yourself, because your story is quite interesting that you went from being anti-nuclear to pro-nuclear. Tell us a bit about that journey as well.
I actually went down to Sizewell for myself to have a look and to look at the waste casks and speak to the residents. Overwhelming support for nuclear there, in my experience. Actually, I was really surprised at how much people were supportive, and what they said was they often had anti-nuclear groups having stalls exactly where we had our stalls, and they said, we're sick of seeing them here. Like, they're not welcome here. Who are they? They don't live here. This is what the residents were saying. They don't live here. They're coming from London. They have second homes. This is where I heard this. And then right after that, there was another protest, a local protest, and there was a celebrity who came down from London, and he actually is quoted in the press saying, this is going to disrupt my lifestyle here. He bought a second home there to have a nice, quiet, peaceful place away from London, and felt that all the, the noise would be disruptive, which, yeah, sure, you can argue about there's definitely an element of there will be disruption, but the way that small community, which is quite loud, he had quite a big protest, and because he's a celebrity, he had quite a lot of people, much more than I was able to gather when I went down there. But the local voices tend to be ignored in my experience, and they were quite frustrated when I spoke to people, because they said, he gets quoted in the press and we don't get asked.
Struan, your community has a long experience of hosting generations. And there's pluses and minuses, I guess, of that. What can you tell me what these are, and tell me what the red lines are, where the needs of the community perhaps have to trump our need for clean energy?
So our community in Caithness, North Sutherland, has been part of various national missions, whether it was fast reactor research technology, whether it's delivering on the submarine delivery programme, or indeed now going into decommissioning. And over successive decades and indeed generations, we have seen a part of the UK that has struggled massively with depopulation, actually be able to attract some of the top talent anywhere in the Commonwealth. That's been a fantastic place to grow up, the access to first-class education, the fact that there was a very competitive spirit when you were growing up, because I would be alongside somebody whose dad was literally a nuclear scientist, and somebody else who would have some experience as well, and there was a real drive. And we have seen for decades a huge economic benefit that's come with the nuclear industry. But at times we have also had to deal with what has been a legacy project and programme. The facts are that the rules, regulations, the practices that were in the 50s, 60s and 70s are not what would be acceptable today. And for that reason, we continue to have to challenge the site, continue to engage with regulators to understand what decommissioning looks like. And there are some quite clear red lines around about some high hazards, and making sure that ultimately the site's primary role is to keep the community safe whilst delivering that national mission. And that's where that dialogue needs to continue.
And Richard, you talked about some fears, some unfounded sometimes fears in communities, but there are risks, obviously, for not just nuclear ones, but social ones and environmental ones for host communities. And these have to be balanced against national need, and I'm sure that's something you wrestled with as a council. Where is the line, and is it right to put national ahead of local?
I think the key thing to look at here, and I think the mistake that Zion's making, is talking to communities immediately around a power station. So the benefits aren't necessarily felt where the impacts are most acutely felt. So if I'm talking about transport corridors, park and ride sites, thousands of HGVs going through communities that aren't ordinarily used to them, potentially and very often communities that demographics are quite different to the town adjacent to the site, so they won't be looking for jobs or employment there. So I think it's that distinction between where impacts are felt and where benefits are felt. Look, I'm clearly pro-nuclear. We need to roll forward the programme. And I think it's important not to shy away from the fact that impacts will be felt locally. I think you need to be honest about that. And when we come to consultation later, I think there are two sorts of consultation. You can look at consultation in terms of should this project happen, or how will this project happen? And I think we need to be very, very honest with communities that when something like a nuclear power station is proposed, it's very likely going ahead, and therefore it's how it should go ahead.
Just very quickly from the two of you, from your communities, on some evidence we heard earlier, this Monday to Thursday economy, do you see that? Do you see it in both areas?
So in Caithness and North Sutherland, we're very fortunate that I think in a way sometimes we think of our remote location as being a detractor, but actually once you're up in my neck of the woods, it's quite hard to get here. So there is a benefit in that actually the permanent workforce is very, very permanent, very, very sticky. I would say the nature of the industry means that there are contractors going across all different types of the nuclear estate, whether that's in decommissioning or indeed in new build. I think one of the things, I think that we have a little bit of a concern about is whenever you are looking at some of that new development, there's going to be thousands and thousands of transient workers that are required, and it's the impact on the communities that that's going to have. You know, when Dounreay was being established, there was multiple workers' camps, there was an apprentice lodge, there was a whole load of infrastructure that was put in very early on to support that development. And I think even as we're trying to deliver nationally critical missions for either decommissioning or continuing to operate existing power stations, the idea that new build is effectively going to add an additional layer on top of that, that's when there is, you know, very substantive impact on it.
Looking at Suffolk, I think the key thing, particularly when we're trying to encourage communities to at least be at ease with these projects, is to secure that sort of local legacy and employment benefit. And Struan's absolutely correct that a lot of the time that's imported workforce. So something we've been working with Sizewell C around is how we have, and Nigel Can, the new CEO there, is how we can have that legacy benefit, whether that's a centre of excellence for operations and maintenance. I think you need to make that pitch for longevity, because this is a community that's experienced nuclear before and experienced that sort of boom and bust. You know, during construction, huge amount of employment, a huge amount of money coming into the area. When construction stops, that can go. So how do you give it that longevity and legacy?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair, and apologies for that.
That's right. Yeah. Oh.
I just think there's something a little bit wrong with that framing of national versus local interest, because actually no one talks about the risk to the communities of losing nuclear once they've had it, and that is something that is really important. I have been down to Wilver, I've interviewed people for an article I wrote there, and I was so touched. And this is someone who came from being anti-nuclear, so I didn't have the great perception of the industry and people, not necessarily the workers, but kind of as a whole. And I spoke to grandparents who said, I spent my whole career at Wilver. I started out as a cleaner. This is not an exaggeration, the stats reflect it. I got apprenticeships, I got training. We had a community because we had regular dances. All of that has gone, and all of my children have had to move away, mostly to London, because they can't find work here. So no one's talking about the risk of the loss of not bridging that gap of fine, we're decommissioning, but what's next for these communities? And they do not want to leave there. I spoke to a young person there who said that she, because there was a promise that Wilfer would go ahead with the previous government, because of that, she went to do a PhD, nuclear engineering, no job for her at the end. She did move to London and she still lives there. She said to me, I'm a first language Welsh speaker. I wanted to stay in Wales, and I will come back to Wales when there's an opportunity here.
Thank you very much. Lizzie.
Okay, well that's interesting for me, coming from a perspective of Heysham, where even with extensions we are moving towards defueling and then decommissioning, and what I'm trying to work out is how to make that a bridge into the next generation of nuclear in Heysham. But I wanted to start talking about consultations, and it was interesting, Struan, what you said before about the timing of consultations, and quite often when we're talking about the planning process, people are consulted on at the end of the process rather than the beginning. What would you change about that when we're talking about nuclear communities, nuclear projects? And would it be different for existing host communities versus new communities? Or outer communities, as Richard pointed out?
I think one of the things that we need to acknowledge is that looking at the roadmap and looking at the UK government's ambitions, I think it's relatively inconceivable that we are talking about new communities in the short to medium term. You know, the discussions that we're going to have are with communities that have already got nuclear installations. I was incredibly impressed by the UK Atomic Energy Authority with their STEP programme. That was as close as I've seen to an open call to communities saying, we have a nationally important project, we are looking for sites that have the experience, have the knowledge, have the land, have the capability of being able to do stuff. And that allowed the earliest form of engagement that I've personally seen in my time as a councillor, and it was actually something that I got heavily involved in as a local councillor, putting it through the Highland Council, getting community support. Because I think one of the things about consultation is, I think it's always going to be flawed unless you have the idea of community consent sitting right at the heart, right at the very start of when we have this. And I think a lot of nuclear communities feel that there is community consent for new nuclear, but we don't have a vehicle to get there, which is very, very frustrating, particularly if you come from Scotland and there's a devolved issue that's sitting in the way. But I think there's also a layer that sits underneath that, which is we're very, very focused in getting the plant operational and getting everything ticked, and the first person hitting that button in the reactor. This is realistically a commitment that we're talking about for a century. So when we're talking about consultation, I think we need to be taking people through the generational I suppose, outlook of these operations, and talking, as I was talking earlier, around about the opportunities that are going to exist right the way through, including the decommissioning bit. Because I think historically, in the 60s, 70s and 80s, that was not a fundamental part of what people looked at, and that's why we're dealing with the legacy elements today.
Okay, well that's interesting, because I wanted to ask about kind of lengthy consultations and how they can potentially strain communities, both I thought it was interesting, Richard, your delineation between kind of inner host communities and then sort of slightly further away ones, and I think I potentially recognise that from my area. So how do you think I'm going to ask this of you, Richard, how do you think consultation can be designed to keep engagement over the life cycle of a project, which can be quite long if we're talking about new build, but also if we're talking about defueling and decommissioning, and kind of avoid some of the frustrations that might come from the communities?
So I think the starting point, and Struan touched on this, is engagement and establishing trust. So I think if you look at Sizewell C, and I'm sure you're familiar with Julia Pike, Nigel Cann, and somebody else worth speaking to is Tom McGarry, who's their former head of comms, now with National Grid. They did a very good job building community trust early, before consultation started, even with groups that were fundamentally opposed to nuclear. So that's a key step. In terms of consultation, I think it's essential, and I'm really actually quite concerned about the proposal to withdraw the requirement for statutory consultation. So Section 42 is proposed to be withdrawn from the Planning Act 2008. It is a fundamental building block. I think the problem here, and what we're not focusing on, and people like it's John Fingleton has sort of pointed the finger at local authorities, saying, you know, you're just taking all of this money and trying to sort of frustrate the consenting process. That's fundamentally untrue. I think where the problem is the fear of judicial reviews on the part of developers and their consultants, which then result in huge, very lengthy documents for consultation. So if government's going to focus on anything, it should be, I think, defining projects of critical national priority that are perhaps not subject to judicial review. And then that, I think, we'll see a much more efficient consultation process. But to your point about consultation lasting throughout the lifetime of the project, absolutely. And I think that's where community engagement groups are key. So we will have site-specific groups, different transport area groups, and keeping that dialogue open is essential. But it's all founded on that initial engagement and establishing trust.
And I want to come on to communicating about nuclear more generally in a moment, but just to kind of stick to consultations, can I come to you, Zion? So you've campaigned both for and against nuclear, which is such an interesting story. I think I must actually say here, Chair, that I've read and endorsed Zion's latest book publicly, so I think it's just for transparency, I need to say that. And I find it very interesting. So I'm wondering, Zion, have you engaged with consultation processes around nuclear projects differently? If so, what was your experience of that, or have you kind of gone down a different route of engaging around nuclear?
Different view as a non-councillor, although I used to be a councillor, and I actually think the way consultations then can be really damaging. Where I live, we had an LTN and
low traffic vehicles.
Yeah, and it was right in my neighbourhood. I was a councillor there. I went to numerous open events to discuss it, and every time they were taken over by a small faction, to the extent that people had to be removed with security. And that LTN was in a trial period, so we were supposed to run it for 9 months to get the data before a decision was made. But there was so much opposition at these events that they cancelled it early. I don't think this is just a nuclear problem. I think there will always be those groups. And what I found really sad at those events was there were no, I was there talking about air pollution. The reasons we were doing it were these specific roads were closed temporarily because the air pollution was above legal limits in those roads. That just never came up. No one talked about that. It was all about people saying, you're doing this to control us, it's a 15 minutes, you do all the usual stuff. And there was no there was no good conversation out of that, and there is research on this that sometimes debate formats can actually just entrench people more. And I don't think, because people turn up in groups, I don't think it's necessarily always the best way to communicate about, especially, I mean, I was going to say heated issues like nuclear, but like I say, that LTN issue was heated and it was scrapped in the end. And at these events, I made a comment at one of these events when I had a queue of people shouting at me, where I said, there's no children here. There's no young people here, there's no vulnerable people, there's no elderly people here who are most impacted by the air pollution on their roads where they were consulted and they agreed to have it, but the surrounding areas just didn't want those roads closed, they didn't want to have to go around. And it was as simple as that. And as I say, we had to cancel it. They moved the bollards out of the way, complete waste of money, frankly, and it will not happen again. And now the council has to come up with a way to bring down the air pollution in those areas without closing the roads, which is the proven method. So I think that can also happen in the nuclear communities, because those groups, which I'm not involved in the consultation process now, but I used to go to events before, that was exactly our tactic, and it worked time and time again.
May I just sort of comment on that? I think Zion's point is valid, but she's grossly oversimplifying consultation and sort of throwing out the baby out with the bathwater by saying public events don't work, therefore consultation is bad. You know, that's one element of it, and yes, they're normally quite forthright events and they can be counterproductive, but I think there's a sense of being seen to do that, and it's about part of establishing trust, that you open yourselves up as a developer to that sort of scrutiny. But there are other areas where consultation can work, whether it's written, whether it's more formal hearings, and through that you can make the effort to reach those hard-to-reach groups that wouldn't necessarily attend an event like that. So I think that's one small aspect of consultation, but not a reason to sort of damn the whole thing.
I wasn't saying you should not do consultations, just to be clear. I was just saying that format can be very counterproductive.
How to do it.
I think there should be better, different ways.
Which I think kind of brings me on to my next thing about talking more generally, communicating around nuclear and particularly around public safety. So communities like mine that host nuclear really don't have any concerns about safety, because we've lived there with no concerns, and we understand the industry, we understand the safety culture, and we understand quite a lot more about the actual effects of radiation than people who don't live near nuclear power stations. However, when we talk about nuclear, a lot of the time people do say safety concerns, or you know, there are groups who are fundamentally opposed to any use of nuclear power, and they say on safety grounds. So I'm wondering, Zion, what communication approaches do you think are most effective in addressing the sort of concerns that ordinary members of the public might have about nuclear projects, about countering misinformation and building informed public support for nuclear?
I think having events is a good idea. I think having communities where they can come and ask their questions. So one thing that we did when I started campaigning for nuclear several years ago was we held stalls around cities in the UK, and we just hand out bananas. We had loads of leaflets, something on radiation, something on meltdowns, everything was covered. And we had literally had queues of people at one point. I have some pictures showing queues of people waiting to ask. There were about 20 of us. A lot of them were volunteers who are in the nuclear sector. We had queues of people with questions. And I thought, isn't that interesting? And a lot of them were quite simple questions that you could just answer, but they didn't have anywhere else to go, and they didn't feel they knew. And I think you see this with almost all areas, right? You have it with vaccines, you have it with LTNs. People don't know where to get their information. They go to the loudest group, usually the one with the best communication, the one with the posters up, the one that's been quoted on the news, and that's where they'll then get their opinion. But what I found is most people were just kind of interested on the fence, and this was in Bristol, Brighton, London. We did quite a few in London, so it wasn't all nuclear communities. 99% of people just had questions.
I'm running out of time. So having a space where people can come and ask questions.
Freely answer questions, yeah. And this has been shown to work with research. It works with vaccine research as well. But when you have people that, like doctors that train in communication, that you can go and ask questions to, the vaccine intake goes up because they feel they were heard and their concerns were addressed.
Thank you. Richard, can I just move on? Around the communication thing again, the Nuclear Regulatory Task Force said the sector shows extreme risk aversion, with regulators making overly conservative, costly decisions disproportionate to the actual risks and disproportionate to any other risk assessment in any other industry, and concluded that regulation needed to change. but obviously that raises questions about trust from the public. How do you think changes to regulation can be communicated with the public and keep the trust that there is in regulation and in the nuclear sector?
It's a really challenging question, I think, because a lot of the fears around nuclear and a lot of fears generally are irrational. You know, it is just a fear. I used to be afraid of flying. Now I'm not. I got over it. But I think so. A lot of it is talking about the piece that Zian's talked about around pitching the benefits of a scheme or a project in order to help people overcome those fears. And I think things that manifest as fears are often products of other frustrations, whether that's the changing face of their community, noise, disruption. These projects can permanently change the places that people live in and the places they love. So that I think the fear is often a manifestation of other things. Now, absolutely, there are those who are across nuclear regulation and would want to be briefed on and informed on any changes. But I think they are few and far between. I think the fears are very often irrational, and it's about pitching the wider project. You could get bogged down in the weeds of trying to talk about too much detail, I think, with communities that don't necessarily or can't necessarily understand those, and in some cases don't necessarily want to.
Yeah. And I've just got a couple of minutes left to talk about sites approaching the end of their operational life, such as Heysham, and the experience of communities going through the transition. So Struan, maybe I could come to you, and what support do you think impacted communities might need?
We're very fortunate in the UK to have the Energy Act and the NDA with, in my opinion, a very, very clear reason to exist, and in my opinion, actually, very proactive people who are involved who have helped massively in understanding what decommissioning is. If you compare that back to the 80s and 90s, at the beginning of the kind of UKE period, it's really night and day. And I think what the NDA have put in place, or particularly around about things like socioeconomics and ensuring that communities are not left behind, not just because we don't want them to be, but actually there's a legislative impairment to make sure that they're supposed to be looked after. I think we should be looking to continue that and to double down on it. I think when we're doing good stuff, we need to do more of it. And I think as more and more sites for the AGR fleet are coming on board, you know, they're going to be taken as part of the ND family effectively. I think the communities that are going to be entering decommissioning should be hearing from communities like mine that are in decommissioning that actually it is quite scary to go from operation to being in decommissioning. I can't imagine, if you've looked after a bit of plant and equipment for 25 years, how it feels to shut it down for the last time and then be told you're not maintaining that anymore, you're going to be tearing it down. That's quite a hard thing. So I think trying to make sure that communities understand that, you know, there is that support that is there. But the second thing is, as well, is from I would say from a UK-wide perspective, that we don't fall into the trap of thinking that decommissioning is inferior to new build and new operations, because unfortunately I feel that is the case. And as somebody that represents constituents who are quite attracted to the idea of operational plant and equipment, either in this country or, as you've heard earlier on today, could be around the world, we need to make sure that the pathways are there to say that the site may be closing, but there is a future not just in the decommissioning industry, but there may be a potential future in new build as well.
I'll start with Struan. Do local authorities have the capability and support needed to carry out planning and regulation oversight of nuclear?
So there's a dynamic that I'm very aware of in Scotland with the devolved government, and one of the frustrations that we have, Chair, is that there's actually sometimes slightly different regulation in England and Wales than there is in Scotland, when actually that regulation might only affect my community, for example, in the far north of Scotland. So I think local authorities sometimes struggle to overcome barriers that might be put in place by the devolved government. Broadly, I feel that local authorities that host nuclear sites have been proactive, ensuring that they have the knowledge within the local authority to support that. The one thing I would say, and this is a broader point, I personally believe that local authorities are becoming less and less local. I represent a local authority in Highland that I believe is similar to the size of Belgium. So the idea that I'm a local councillor is slightly laughable, but what I would say is that then when you're looking at policy, you're looking at things like the planning framework when we're going through, for example, storage of nuclear material. You're trying to have a conversation with somebody that might be hundreds of miles away but is in the same local authority, and that is a challenge that we need to overcome, and that's why I think trying to have as much decision-making power done as locally as possible in the first instance, and then potentially having that then validated elsewhere is a very sensible way of dealing with it, because I think if you're able to get those knowledgeable about something that have a community consent about something and then be able to get it approved, that's a sensible way to streamline some things like that.
That's very helpful. And Richard, with the move to criteria-based siting, we could see nuclear proposals in areas with no previous nuclear experience. What sort of challenges do you think that will bring for local authorities? I mean, you're chair of the local authorities group on this.
I think there's a couple of elements to this. I think, first of all, it very much depends on the community that will be hosting it. So as I said earlier, if it's an area with a former industrial background, then I think you'll find that it's far more welcoming. If it's somewhere like Sizewell that hasn't seen anything like this before, then altogether more challenging on that sort of emotional and community level. From a resourcing point of view as well, deeply challenging if they haven't done this before. That's where planning performance agreements are key, i.e. the funding from the developer to the council to resource up for this. But I don't think you can downplay the expertise that sits within local authorities and how essential that is to things like the discharge of requirements. I think those recommendations, recommendation 30 from it was recommendation 30 from John Fingleton, was something around the fact that between DESNES and the MOD, they should be responsible for discharging nationally. I just don't see how nationally you could have that local knowledge to discharge planning conditions. So I think with proper funding and resourcing, local authorities are the right place to do this, but it would be challenging to sort of upskill quickly.
Authorities, are there examples of good practice now?
I would say this, but I think if you look to Suffolk, where we're a centre of excellence for nationally significant infrastructure projects, and I think because we face not just nuclear but a myriad of offshore wind farms, interconnectors, solar, you do establish that expertise, and groups like NLAG and others and the LGA can ensure that expertise is shared across local authorities.
Okay, great. Yes, Struan.
Just briefly, one of the areas of concerns I know we've seen, because I think that the point around about other nationally important infrastructure happening alongside new build is really well made as well. I think we're going to be in a very tricky position. I think yourselves representing constituents would be in a tricky position if constituents feel that planning time and priority is only focused on some of the national things. You know, if your constituent down the road is taking 2 years to get their extension, I know it might sound trivial in the grand scheme of things, but we all know from casework that actually that's fundamental, and I think it comes back to the idea of community consent. You know, if people are believing in something and knowing that there's a degree of equilibrium about it, I think that's where we need to make sure it's fairness, and that's where the funding element is absolutely key to ensure that the day-to-day can absolutely keep on going, but the strategic stuff has its proper resource as well.
The point about rebuilding the capacity in local authorities has been well made multiple times, including to us. So, can I thank you for your evidence in this relatively short session? It's very helpful to us. That is the end of today's proceedings. Order.